true self. As yoga was defined in I. 2 in terms of the suppression of vittas, so here kriya, yoga is defined in terms of the weakening, tanu, kara, of what we will discover are the underlying cause of the vittas, the klesas. We are thus moving into a deeper psychological level of the siddha. In fact, the klesas become like burnt seeds, scorched by the fire of discrimination, and thus they become unproductive, and one is no longer subject to these afflictions and the klaya, detrimental, vittas they produce. We noted earlier that klaya is from the same root as klesa. In Vaikaspati Misra's understanding, kriya, yoga weakens the afflictions, at which point discrimination, no longer overcome by these powerful enemies, can manifest and burn them further. Otherwise, the klesas are present at all times. Without performing kriya, yoga, says Akara, one may know theoretically from the scriptures and the teachings of the gurus that prakti and purua are different, but this type of knowledge in and of itself will not remove the klesas, and thus there will be no experiential realization of these theoretical ideas. 6. Consequently, one will remain victimized by these klesas: ignorance, ego, desire, etc. Hence Patanjali is prescribing that one must actively perform kriya, yoga. Recall that under normal circumstances, every seed of karma must at some point bear its fruit. Since there are unlimited seeds of karma, which cannot all fructify during a single lifetime, one must be reborn in order to experience all one's just karmic fruits lying in storage. Upon being reborn and experiencing the fruits of these previously stored seeds of karma, however, more actions are performed in response, each one planting more seeds of karma, and the vicious cycle of birth and death is perpetuated. As has been discussed, any single action triggers a potentially unending series of reactions, since one solitary action produces a reaction, which, when it eventually bears fruit, prompts a response or reaction, prompting a reaction, provoking a reaction, and so on unlimitedly. By kriya, yoga, these seeds are burnt and so no longer ripen and bear the fruit of repeated experiences in the world of sasra. Simultaneously, as the klesas are weakened, sattva is enhanced, and, as this happens, the discrimination of the difference between the purua soul and prakti matter can arise. Some scholars feel that the jump in subject matter from the previous chapter on samadhi to the kriya, yoga orientation of this chapter points to the patchwork nature of the text. After all, the path to samadhi was defined earlier as stilling the mind, and here as actively engaging in devotion, austerity, and study. As Feuerstein, 1979, has long argued, however, there is an organic transition and fundamental structural coherence between the two. Sutra I. 2 defines the primary goal, siddha, vitti, nara, the pacification of the mind, and 1 concern themselves with those subconscious mechanisms triggering these vittas, the klesas. The distinction in terminologies and practices in this chapter merely reflects the requirements of a deeper level of psychological analysis and subsequent remedial activity. This chapter is thus an indispensable continuation of the first, providing more specific technical information as to the psychological mechanisms underpinning the siddha, vittas that Sutra I. requires the yogi to still. Without eliminating the klesas, there is no question of bringing about this ultimate state, samadhi, bhavna. 3 Avidyasmita, raga, dvabhinav kliya vidya, ignorance, asmita, ego, raga, attachment, dva, aversion, abhinav, clinging to life, will to live, kli, impediments. The impediments to samadhi are nescience, ego, desire, aversion, and clinging to life. The klesas have been referred to throughout the commentaries thus far, and implicitly referred to at the beginning of the text itself in I. 5, where the vittas are stated as being klaya or akliya. Patanjali now formally introduces them here. As we have encountered elsewhere, Patanjali's method when he presents a sutra containing a list is to discuss each item subsequently in separate sutras, so the 5 klesas will be examined individually in the next sutras. Klesa is often used as a synonym for dukkha, suffering, and, indeed, sasaric existence, which Patanjali will describe below as dukkha, is perpetuated as a result of the klesas. When these klesa impediments to samadhi are in full force, says Vyasa, they strengthen the influence of the gunas, produce karma, the law of cause and effect, and, by mutual interaction, bring forth the fruits of karma. Patanjali will later define these fruits as the type of birth, life duration, and life experience a person generates in accordance with the quality of actions he or she performs. By mutual interaction, elaborates Vijnabhikkhu, anticipating the next sutra, Vyasa intends that the klesa of ignorance breeds the remainder attachment, ego, aversion, and clinging to life, and these produce further ignorance in a vicious cycle. Thus, when ignorance is destroyed, so are the other klesas. In short, these 5 impediments, which are all located in the mind, trigger and perpetuate samsara, the world of change, that is, of birth and death. Recall that Patanjali stated in I.5 that the vittas can be klaya, that is, produced by these klesas, or akleya. If we take the latter term literally, this seems to indicate that there can be vittas that are not produced by the klesas, that is, not subject to ignorance, attachment, etc. This can point only to the notion of the jivanmuta, someone who is still embodied and thus functioning with a citta, but a citta that generates vittas that are not subject to ignorance, ego, attachment, etc. Recent scholarship, Witcher, 1998, Chapel 2008, has consistently and persuasively argued that it is a misconception to consider yoga to be a radical withdrawal from the world. Rather, it entails enlightened engagement with the world, that is, action stemming from akleya, vittas. There are certainly solid grounds to support this position. 2. For avidya ketram udharam prasipta, tanu, vikina dream avidya, ignorance, ketram, field, udharam, of the others, prasipta, dormant, tanu, weak, vikina, interrupted, intermittent, you dream, activated, manifest ignorance is the breeding ground of the other klesas, whether they are in a dormant, weak, intermittent, or fully activated state. Patanjali gives the important information here, in resonance with all Indic soteriological thought, that ignorance, avidya, is the foundation of all the other klesas, the field, ketra, within which they grow, and hence the ultimate cause of samsara. Like a piece of land is the substratum for bushes, creepers, grass, plants, etc. Says Akara, so ignorance supports the other klesas. When ignorance is dispelled, the other klesas disappear. Adopting what one might nowadays consider a psychoanalytical tone, Patanjali also differentiates among 4 different states in which the 5 klesas manifest. Vyasa defines these as the dormant state, prasipta, when the klesas reside in the mind in potential form as seeds. Akara qualifies this by noting that only the klesas other than ignorance can be found in a dormant state. Ignorance is never dormant, since it is the cause and support of the others and thus is always manifest. Otherwise, according to Vijnabhikkhu, a klesa may be dormant for a long time, even 2 or 3 births, before reactivating. These dormant seeds eventually germinate when a person encounters particular situations or contexts that serve as triggers. They then develop into the fully activated, uttara, klesas mentioned in the sutra, klesas that are actually exerting their influence on the mind at a given time. When the klesas are continually interrupted, appearing and then fading away, they are described as intermittent, vikina, the 3rd state listed in the sutra. For example, says Vyasa, when the klesa of attachment for something is present, aversion for it is absent. Aversion may succeed attachment, but the two do not occur simultaneously. 7. In other words, clarifies Vijnabhikkhu, aversion is not totally absent from a person when some other emotion like attachment is present, it is just in abeyance or latent, and, of course, vice versa. Therefore, it can be considered intermittent. Or, continues Vyasa with a rare touch of humor, just because Katra is attracted to one particular woman at one point in time does not mean he is disinterested in other women. He happens to be interested in one particular woman in the present, but he may become interested in some other woman in the future. These future attachment klises featuring other women remain either in dormant, weak, or interrupted states while the present klisa is running its course. Intermittent klises differ from dormant klises, the first item on the list, insofar as they remain inactive for shorter periods of latency, according to Vijñanabhikkhu. When, according to Vyasa, one consciously cultivates a state of mind that is the opposite of the klises, they become weak, tanu, the second state noted by Patanjali. Indeed, Vaikaspati Misra and Vijñanabhikkhu note that one desiring liberation should actively counteract these klises. 1. Can accomplish this by the practice of Kriya, Yoga, which Patanjali has indicated weakens the klises, tanu, kara, I. 2. The practice of cultivating their opposites and pondering their consequences, which we will encounter in 2:34, also weakens the klises. Thus, right knowledge dispels its opposite, the klisa of ignorance, discrimination of the difference between purua, the real self, and prakti dispels its opposite, the klisa of ego, the false self. Detachment dispels its opposites of both the klises of attachment and aversion, since they are two sides of the same coin, and the realization of the eternally of the soul dispels the klisa of clinging to life. More than being weakened, Vyasa continues, ultimately these klises can be burnt by yogis who have cultivated deep meditation, and they then completely lose their power to activate even when the yogi encounters situations that would under normal circumstances trigger their activation. Such yogis are said to have had their last birth. The klises therefore can actually be found in 5 states, according to Vyasa. Since they continue to exist when they have been burnt, but have lost their power to produce effects, the burnt or impotent state can be added to the list of 4 mentioned in the sutra, making a total of 5. Akara says this burnt state was not included by Patanjali in the sutra because burnt seeds are not common to all living beings as is the case with the other 4 states, and this sutra concerns itself with the klises as generally found present among embodied beings. Only in the yogi is a burnt category to be found. 2. 5 Anityasusi, Tukmasunitya, Susi, Sukatma, Kyatiravidya Anitya, non-eternal, temporal, Asusi, impure, Tukka, painful, Anatmasu, the non-self, that which is not Atman, Nitya, eternal, Susi, pure, Sukha, joyful, Atma, self, Kiti, notion, perception, Avidya, ignorance. Ignorance is the notion that takes the self, which is joyful, pure, and eternal, to be the non-self, which is painful, unclean, and temporary. Patanjali here gives a very important definition of ignorance. The primary cause of all bondage, avidya, ignorance, entails confounding the nature of the soul with that of the body. The body is here described as painful, tukka, unclean, asusi, and temporary, anitya, unlike the purua who is joyful, sukha, pure, susi, and eternal, nitya. We notice from the prefixes to these 2 sets of phrases that these 2 entities are exact opposites. 8. Thus, by adding the negating prefix a, or du, to the adjectives in the first part of the sutra to the same adjectives in the second part, Patanjali is efficiently underscoring the fact that conventional awareness is the exact opposite of true knowledge. To confuse the two, or misidentify the latter with the former, is avidya. While anyone can understand that the body is temporary, 9. What does Patanjali intend by saying it is unclean? Vyasa quotes a verse, "The learned consider this body to be unclean, on account of its location, origin, sustenance, excretions, death, and the continual need to keep it clean." As always, the commentators elaborate on why the body might be considered unclean due to these things. The location of the body can be seen as unclean because in its embryonic form it is situated near the mother's excrement and urine, Its origin is sperm and blood, its sustenance is fluids produced from food and drink, and its excretions are the discharges from the various outlets of the body: urine, feces, sweat, and mucus. There are various views of the body in Hindu knowledge systems. Ayurveda depicts the body as a complex combination of substances, ditas, that need to be kept in appropriate balance. The Kama, Sastras, desire texts, see the body as a means through which one can experience intense sensual enjoyment in skillfully manipulated circumstances. Tantra considers the body to be a manifestation of Siddhi, Sakti, divine energy. Bhakti construes the body as a temple that can be used in the service of God. These views are not mutually exclusive, but the ascetic tradition tends to view the body as a rather unpleasant bag of obnoxious substances. In reality, as the cliché goes, beauty is skin deep, and a beautiful body is just a bag of bodily fluids and organs, which can be unpleasant and repulsive when taken out of their natural biological context. Thus, part of Patanjali's definition of ignorance in the sutra is that in the unclean or impure there is an illusion of purity or beauty, which, as Vyasa puts it, means considering this very distasteful body to be pure, like the man enamored of a woman, beautiful like the rising new moon, with limbs made of honey and nectar and eyes as large as the blue lotus, who enthuses the world of men with flirtatious glances. 10. But despite such surface-level attractions, all in all, any body is in reality a sack of potentially rather embarrassing substances. Its real nature is evidenced by the need to constantly clean it, and Patanjali will later refer to the practice of cleanliness, essentially an act of removing the discharges and excretions of the body, as a catalyst that, if performed with the goals of yoga in mind, can lead to dispelling any erotic fantasies about the reality of the body. Realization of the nature of the body becomes most vivid during old age and at death. Nobody wants to linger around a decomposing body. In this same vein, the Buddha advised his followers to actually contemplate the reality of the impurities of the body, that is, the bodily substances which, taken out of context, would be considered obnoxious, specifically that the body is simply a collection of hair, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinews, bones, marrow, kidney, heart, liver, membranes, spleen, lungs, stomach, bowels, intestines, excrement, bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, tears, serum, saliva, mucus, synovial fluid, urine. 11. Indeed, he actually prescribes a series of visual meditations on these realities, and moreover Picus monks, a brother, just as if he had seen a body abandoned in the charnel field, dead for 1, 2, or 3 days, swollen, turning black and blue, and decomposed, applies that perception to this very body, of his own, reflecting, this body, too, is even so constituted, is of even such a nature, has not gone beyond that fate. And moreover Picus monks, a brother, just as if he had seen a body abandoned in the charnel field reduced to a chain of bones hanging together by tendons, with flesh and blood yet about it, or stripped of flesh but yet spotted with blood, or cleaned of both flesh and blood, or reduced to bare bones, loosed from tendons, scattered here and there, so that the bones of a hand lie in one direction, in another the bones of a foot, in another, those of a leg, in another a thigh bone, in another the pelvis, in another the pineal vertebrae, in another the skull, applies that perception to this very body, of his own, thinking, this body, too, is even so constituted, is of such a nature, has not gone beyond that fate. 12. In short, the yoga tradition does not consider the body a suitable place to seek happiness for those interested in enlightenment. Patanjali will make the same point in 2:15 by pointing to the notion of finding pleasure in what is really pain, says Vyasa. Patanjali and the commentators have a good deal more to say about the nature of the body below. The non-self, and Atman, referred to by Patanjali here, says Vyasa, actually consists not only of the body, which is the locus for enjoyment, and the mind, which is an instrument through which the awareness of Purua can contact the world, but also the accessories or paraphernalia of the body, whether animate, such as spouse, animals, and offspring, or inanimate, such as furniture or food. Although one may think that one's body, one's mind, and even one's possessions are one's real self, they are not, and to confound them as such is ignorance. Vyasa quotes a verse that the commentators ascribe to Pankasika, an ancient authority in the Skit tradition, one who regards objects, whether animate or inanimate, as part of one's self, rejoicing when these things prosper, and lamenting upon their demise, is deluded. 13 As the Gita puts it, the wise, Pate, lament neither for the living nor the dead. 2. 11. I must acknowledge a Vedantic slant in my translation of the sutra, where joy, purity, and eternally are imputed to the soul. Most translators, traditional and modern, translate the sutra perfectly appropriately along the following lines: ignorance is the apprehension of the joyful, the pure, the eternal, and the self in that which is painful, unclean, temporary, and the non-self. Unlike the Vedanta tradition, the Skya Yoga tradition, along with the Nyaya and Vaiyika traditions, at least in their classical expressions, generally do not speak of the experience of the liberated Purua as blissful but rather as an absence of suffering. 14 Even Vijanabhikkhu, who otherwise does not hesitate to blend Vedantic notions into his commentary, states in his Yoga, Sara, Sagraha that we do not subscribe to the Neo-Vedantics who imagine that ultimate liberation consists of the attainment of supreme bliss. 15 However, an argument can be made that, in contrast to the qualities of the non-self, Patanjali is alluding to the Upanyatic view that the real self, and he uses the Upanyatic term Atman for the soul here is Sukha, blissful. Both scholars and some traditional commentators have disregarded the possibility that Patanjali might be explicitly introducing an Upanyatic concept, the blissfulness of the self, underscored by his specific usage of the Upanyatic term Atman. In Vedanta, the highest self consists of bliss, Anandamaya Abhyasat, Vedanta Sutras I. 1.13, but there is an assumption in some expressions of the yoga tradition that the nature of the self is pure consciousness without any content whatsoever, including bliss. Vyasa himself speaks of the bliss of liberation, compared to which even the highest bliss of worldly pleasure including the states of sattva are considered suffering. Vyasa in general is quite comfortable correlating Purua with the Brahman of the Upanishads, for example, 3:34, as has always been standard for any orthodox Hindu thinker. Whatever direction the later tradition took in this matter, this sutra can be read as indicating that Patanjali, too, subscribed to this view. Overall, Patanjali has very little to say about the nature of the actual experience of Purua attained in Nirbhaja, or Asamprajanata, Samadhi, since, naturally, this state is beyond words and conceptualization, and thus beyond description. But this sutra can be read as suggesting that it is a state of sukha, happiness, compared to all experiences other than that of the self, which are ultimately various shades of dukkha, suffering, frustration. Clearly, the prospect of a positive experience of ultimate bliss in the liberated state is far more enticing for one considering the arduous path of yoga than merely the prospect of the cessation of pain. The term sukha or ananda is used in the Vedanta tradition as an inherent characteristic of the ultimate self. 16 The Gita uses the term a number of times to describe the experience of the self, v. 21:6, 21:27-28, 14:27, making it clear, however, that this type of sukha, unlike the ephemeral and fleeting sukha of sensual indulgence, is akayam, imperishable, v. 21, Atyantikam, infinite, 6. 21:28, Uttamam, the highest, 6. 27, and Akantika, absolute, 14:27. The Taittiriya Upanishad goes a step further and, in a rhetorical or figurative mode, attempts to quantify the unquantifiable experience of bliss inherent in the self according to the Upanishadic tradition. Let us take a young man, a first-class young man who is the most learned, cultured and strong person. And let us suppose that he owns this whole world with all its resources. This situation would constitute one measure of human bliss. A single measure of the bliss of earthly Gandharv celestials equals 100 measures of human bliss. A single measure of the bliss of celestial Gandharvs equals 100 measures of the bliss of earthly Gandharvs. A single measure of bliss of the forefathers, who live long in their realm, equals 100 measures of the bliss of celestial Gandharvs. A single measure of the bliss enjoyed by the gods who attain their status by birth, equals 100 measures of bliss of the forefathers. A single measure of bliss of the gods who attain their status by good deeds, equals 100 measures of the bliss of those gods who attain their status by birth. A single measure of the bliss of Indra, king of the gods, equals 100 measures of the bliss of the other gods. A single measure of the bliss of the sage of the gods, Baspati, equals 100 measures of the bliss of Indra. A single measure of the bliss of Prajapati, the progenitor of species, equals 100 measures of the bliss of Baspati. A single measure of the bliss of Brahman equals 100 measures of the bliss of Prajapati. 2. 8. In other words, the bliss of Brahman is countless times greater than whatever might constitute the highest level of human bliss. With such figurative language, these texts try to point to the experience of Brahman/Atman/Purusha as not only a state of bliss, but one that is far more blissful than any pleasurable experience connected with Prakriti, the world of matter. A further somewhat technical point is that in Sanskrit, the word for ignorance is avidya. As in English, words like a theist or a temporal, and a prefix to a noun in Sanskrit indicates an absence of the thing in question, so avidya literally means a lack of vidya, knowledge. However, ignorance, says Vyasa, is not just the absence of right knowledge but is an actual type of perception in its own right, a perception of reality that is the opposite of true knowledge. Just as amitra, enemy, literally, a plus mitra, not plus friend, does not merely mean the absence of a friend but an actual real inimical person in his or her own right, so avidya is a real mental state, not just an absence of knowledge. Thus the kleshas are actual in the Siddha. There are differences among the Hindu philosophical schools as to what constitutes ignorance, and Vijnanabhika points out in this regard that yoga philosophy differs from its sister school of Skya, which takes ignorance to be lack of discrimination rather than an actual state of mind in its own right. Also, although Vyasa seems to equate avidya with the viti of viparya, error, in I. 8, avidya appears to be a more fundamental element in the subconscious. It underpins all the vitas, including prama, right knowledge, by which the viparya, viti is dispelled. Error simply means to perceive reality incorrectly on occasion and thus may come and go. Ignorance here, avidya, means much more fundamentally to confuse purusha with prakriti and remains permanent until enlightenment is attained, even though the other kleshas, as noted above, can be intermittent, etc. In other words, even if surface level error, viparya, has been dispelled by surface level prama, right knowledge, both these vitas are still underpinned by a deep structure level of ultimate ignorance. Viparya is a conscious state but not necessarily a permanent or fundamental one. Avidya, in contrast, operates constantly at the very deepest level of the subconscious, until it is dispelled by true knowledge prior to liberation. The topic of ignorance is discussed extensively by all philosophical schools since it is, after all, the cause of bondage for almost all soteriological traditions of Indic thought, and the commentators introduce Vedantic analogies here. Vijnanabhika gives the familiar example of silver and mother, of pearl to illustrate ignorance. Taking the body and the things of the manifest world to be real and eternal is like mistaking mother, of pearl to be silver. Hariharananda gives the other classic Vedantic example of the snake and the rope. A person walking along at dusk happens upon a rope lying on the path but mistakes it for a snake and is alarmed. Similarly, ignorance is taking one thing for another, in this case, perceiving the non-self as the real self, a false cognition but a cognition nonetheless. Therefore, although ignorance can be dispelled by vidya, its opposite, or, to use the more specific yogic term, viveka, discrimination, ignorance in yoga philosophy is an actual state of mind, rather than just an absence of vidya or discrimination as some other schools hold. One might note, given the yoga school's engagement with aspects of Buddhist teachings, that Patanjali defines ignorance in exactly the same terms as used by the Buddha, with one essential and dramatic reversal. Instead of ignorance being defined as the notion that takes the self, which is joyful, pure, and eternal, to be the non-self, which is painful, impure, and temporary, as Patanjali has done here, Buddhist teachings consider ignorance to be the notion that takes the Atman, the absence of self, which is a joyful, pure, and eternal state, to be an autonomous independent Atman, a notion that results in a painful, impure, and temporary state. Paisamhit Sutta 8.2.3. This essential difference will be addressed at various places below, but we can note here that in Buddhism there is no autonomous Atman, Purua, self that can be separated from its interdependence with Prakti. Not only is there no Purua, but clinging to notions of such an entity is a primary cause of ignorance rather than enlightenment. The two views are thus diametrically opposed. The very goal of yoga and of human existence in the yoga school is the very cause of bondage and ignorance in Buddhism. 2. 6 dg. Darsana, Saktir Ekatmati Vasmita dk, the subjective power of seeing, the seer, Darsana, instrumental power of seeing, sight, Aktya, of the powers, eka, 1, Atmata. Nature, Eva, as if, Asmita, ego is to consider the nature of the seer and the nature of the instrumental power of seeing to be the same thing. Moving on to Asmita, the second of Patanjali's classes, dk, the seer, is a reference to the awareness of Purua, referred to in I. 3 Esdra, another derivation of the same verbal root d, to c17. The instrumental power of sight, darsana, on the other hand, refers to the intelligence aspect of the siddha, that is, to buddhi as the instrument of awareness. Buddhi is the first pyrrhic layer enveloping Purua and presents images of the sense objects in the world, and indeed all vittas, to the Purua. It is therefore the primary instrument in the power of sight, the senses proper, such as the actual physical sense of sight, although also instruments, can make their impressions known to Purua only through buddhi, when it molds itself into their forms. The metaphor for this process, we recall, is that of liquid copper poured into a mold. In other words, without buddhi as primary instrument, Purua would have no awareness of prakti. Patanjali thus defines ego, asmita, as the attribute of misidentifying buddhi, the instrumental power of sight, with the Purua soul, the actual seer. I like to give the example of a person wearing spectacles to see clearly, but due to mental disorder refusing to remove them, imagining that the spectacles are his very self rather than an instrument perched on his nose facilitating perception. In a sense, the ego entails doing just this, imagining that the mind and body, which are simply instruments allowing awareness to perceive the world, are the actual self. Another way of putting this is that the act of experience, says Vyasa, becomes possible when the experiencer and that which is experienced, two completely distinct categories and metaphysical entities, are considered to be one and the same, ekatmata. It is ego that promotes this confusion. Ego is the specific aspect of ignorance that identifies the non-self, specifically the intelligence, with the true self, Purua, Atman. It is the knot in the heart, says Ramananda Sarasvati, that ties these two entities together. Indeed, says Vijanabhikkhu, the very act of experience itself means the identification of Purua with buddhi. Experience means experiencing an object other than the subject of experience. However, when one understands the true natures of these two distinct entities, continues Vyasa, one no longer attempts to enjoy this world, and complete uncoupling of Purua from Prakti, liberation, becomes possible. Vyasa quotes a verse, not perceiving the Purua self to be distinct from the Buddhi intelligence in form, nature, and awareness, one makes the mistake of considering the intelligence to be the true Atman self as a result of illusion. 18. The difference between the two, notes Vaikaspati Misra, is that the self is unchanging, and the intelligence ever-changing. As a result of this misidentification, says Vihana Bhikkhu, one identifies with the states of the intelligence, and so one thinks oneself to be peaceful, or awake, or learned, or whatever state is present in the intelligence. But in reality, it is the intelligence that is experiencing these states. Vijanabhikku points out that the two classes of ego and ignorance are to some extent the same thing, but there is a difference in degree. Ignorance initially involves a not yet specific notion of I-ness, a sense of self as being something as yet undefined other than Purua, a partial identification of the real self with Buddhi, the intelligence, while ego involves a more developed or complete identity between the Purua self and Buddhi. For example, he says, identifying oneself with one's spouse and children is analogous to ignorance, but actually feeling their happiness and distress is analogous to ego. Thus the difference is one of degree. Ego evolves out of ignorance and makes the misidentification of non-self with self more concrete and specific. It should be reiterated here that the asmita, ego, as the effect of buddhi under the influence of ignorance, is different from that produced in the higher stages of samadhi by the pure sattvic buddhi, as has been discussed. The asmita in the context of samadhi in Sutra I-17 is true discrimination manifest in the citta, that is, correct identification of the Purua as the real source of I-am-ness. Asmita in the present context of the classes is false identification, considering the I am to be the praktic mind and body, due to the absence of such true discrimination. I am female, I am fat, I am hungry, I am a dog. Therefore, asmita, referred to as ahakra in Skya, is pivotal in terms of determining the choice the mind will take, in terms of whether it wishes to direct its attention to Purua or to Prakti. That choice will be either the observable world or a quest for liberating wisdom, jnana. Ahakra then is that critical moment during which one of these goals must be chosen. The choice is either spiritual Purua or Prakti. This is to choose between infinity and finitude, wisdom or unwisdom, knowledge or ignorance. This is the skin either, or, the human plight which points to the need for the healing medicine of yoga spirituality and discipline. Although this definitive choice certainly exists, phenomenal individuality and material identity unfolded by ahakra also threaten to become a prison of bondage. Humans may choose to lock themselves into such a phenomenal world and fail to search further for liberating wisdom. Podgorski 1984, 164. One might mention here that asmita and the ahakra of the Skya system are roughly synonymous but etymologically can be taken to refer, perhaps, to slightly different functions of the ego. Ahakra is not used by Patanjali, but occurs in Vyasasbhya in I-45 and 3-47, where it is treated synonymously with asmita. The etymological meaning of ahakra is I am the doer and is defined in the Gita as the channeling of consciousness outward through the mind and senses into the world of objects, with the individual imagining himself or herself, due to illusion, to be the doer of actions in the world, actions that are actually being carried out by the mechanical forces of nature, prakti. In K.S. words, the soul, bewildered by ahakra, thinks I am the doer of deeds that are actually being done by the guas of prakti. 3:27. Asmita is an unusual grammatical construction, as my means I am, the first person singular of the present tense of the verb as, to be, and hence asmita, literally means I am-ness. 19. Both ahakra and asmita therefore involve consciousness refracting outward away from its source and being falsely identified with its praktic embeddedness. But if there is a difference between ahakra as defined in the Gita and asmita as defined in the sutra as a klisa, it is that the emphasis of the former is on the false I as a doer of action, while the emphasis of the latter is on the false I as a periodic entity, I am a man, a woman, sad, etc. In other words, the Gita emphasizes the mistaken notion of I am, the doer, ness, whereas Patanjali emphasizes the false sense of I am, ness, a difference that resonates with the different concerns of the two texts, the former with action in the world and action in devotion, and the latter with realization of the true self. 2. 7 Sukhanozayirga Sukha, happiness, anasai, the consequence, rga, attachment. Attachment stems from experiences of happiness. Moving on to the third klisa, Vyasa simply says that the hankering, desire, or craving for pleasure, sukha, or the means to attain pleasure by one who remembers past experiences of pleasure is attachment, raga. The key ingredient in this process is memory. One who has experienced pleasure in the past recollects it and hankers to repeat the experience in the present or future, or to attain the means of repeating the experience. It is this dwelling on past experiences that constitutes attachment. Vaikaspati Misra adds that ego is the root of attachment, just as ignorance is the root of ego. Consequently, ego precedes attachment in the list of klisas as ignorance precedes ego. The commentators outline the psychology of attachment in the following manner: when a new means of pleasure is perceived, it is memory that infers that this new means of pleasure is the same as or similar to something that produced pleasure in the past, and hence it promises to provide the same or similar pleasure in the present or future. Therefore, memory precedes attachment, that is, attachment is predicated on memory. Hariharananda adds that previous impressions, saskras, of pleasure can remain latent in the mind, and thus even when memory is not consciously activated, these latent saskras cause the mind and senses to be unconsciously drawn toward objects that have produced pleasure in the past. Hence one might find oneself partial to something for no particular conscious reason, which, from the perspective of yoga psychology, could correspond to latent imprints from previous lives. The phenomenon of déjà vu is explainable in similar manner. Ignorance and ego cause the deluded mind to associate the self with these latent saskras as well, identifying the self with the senses through which these latent impulses toward pleasure can be expressed. These klisas thus cause the mind to identify the self with the non-self, namely, the body and the mind. Hariharananda also makes the important observation that when desire deepens into greed, the sense of right and wrong, morality, becomes neglected. The stronger the greed, the more a person is liable to pursue immoral means of obtaining the objects of desire. The Gita outlines the sequence of events: from contemplating the objects of the senses, an attachment to them is born; from attachment, desire arises, and from desire is produced anger. 20 From anger comes illusion, and from illusion, confusion of memory. From confusion of memory, intelligence is destroyed, and from the loss of intelligence, one is lost. 2. 62 to 63, Vijanabhiku adds as an aside that the desire of the Jivanmutta, or liberated but still embodied soul, most probably a reference to the desire to help other embodied beings, is not an attachment at all and thus not a klisa perpetuating sasra. This is because the desire of a liberated soul is not for personal pleasure or gratification, or, ultimately, stemming from ignorance at all. 2. 8 Tuknuadvatuka, pain, anasai, the consequence, dva, aversion. Aversion stems from experiences of pain. Vyasa explains aversion, dva, the fourth klisa, in a parallel manner to the previous klisa of attachment, the feeling of resistance, anger, frustration, and resentment toward pain and its causes, by one who remembers past experiences of similar pain, is aversion. The commentators state that this sutra is to be understood along the same lines as the last one: aversion, dves and h, after all, is the flip side of the same coin as attachment. When we resist or resent something, or are angry or frustrated over something, it is because of a remembrance that this thing caused us pain in the past. 2. 9 Svarasa, Vahi Vijay Pita Thro Binavyasva, On, Rasa, potency, juice, Vahi, carrying, bearing, Vijwa, the possessor of wisdom, the wise, API, even, Tatha, also, Ra, pervaded, grown, established, Abhinavya, clinging to life. The tendency of clinging to life affects even the wise, it is an inherent tendency. The commentators consider this clinging to life klisa, Abhinavya, to be a synonym for the fear of death. All living beings, says Vyasa, wish that they would never die and could live forever. The inherent nature of such a wish, he says, suggests that the nature of death has been experienced in the past. From this one can conclude that one has undergone previous births. In other words, just as the previous sutras indicated that attachment or aversion to something is caused by positive or negative memories of that thing, aversion to death likewise indicates that one's memory retains unpleasant recollections of past deaths, although these are latent or subconscious in the present life. It is perhaps because fear of death pertains to past life rather than present life. Sastras, suggests Bali's Lef, 1991, that clinging to life is characterized as an independent klisa, rather than relegated under the category of the previous klisa of dva, aversion. Even a newly born worm is afraid of death, Vaikaspati Misra argues to make this case. This fear cannot be explained by the standard means of attaining knowledge established by Patanjali in I. 7. Direct perception, inference, or verbal testimony. In other words, Vijanabhiku elaborates, one might argue that a person's fear of death need not be based on previous death experiences in past lives but can easily be accounted for by the fact that one directly perceives death around one and can thus infer that one, too, is going to die. Or, one might attain this knowledge of the imminence of death from the testimony of reliable people such as parents or teachers, or from scriptures or books of knowledge. But a newly born worm has not had these perceptions or inferences or testimonies yet nonetheless displays a fear of death. The same innate fear of death is visible in the human infant, says Vaikaspati Misra. A newborn infant cannot have inferred the reality of death or heard about it any more than the worm. Given the yoga position indicated in the last verse that dva, aversion, like raga, attachment, is the product of memory, how can this innate fear of death be accounted for unless all creatures have latent recollections of previous deaths? Such experiences are embedded in the citta in the form of saskras, or mental imprints, that subconsciously cause creatures to avoid death. These saskras underlie the clinging to life of all creatures noted in the sutra. This seems to be a form of a long-standing argument offered by most Hindu sects in defense of the existence of the soul. 21 That instinctive memories in the newborn and, indeed, any type of memories whatsoever, require a pre-existing substratum, or soul, on which to initially inhere, or find their support. As Patanjali indicates in the sutra, the klisa of clinging to life is found even in the learned, not just the ignorant. The vidvan, here in the genitive form vijo, is one who has vidya, knowledge, that is, one who is learned in the scriptures. Even the wise pursuing liberation, who are aware of the temporality of all things, are subject to this klisa, say the commentators. This is because it is a stronger saskra than other saskras, says Vijanabhiku, although Vaikaspati Misra adds that this is the case only for those whose wisdom is based on perception, inference, and testimony, not for those who have actually attained samadhi. 2. 10 Te Pratiprasava, Hey Skma with Makron Te, these 5 klesas, Pratiprasava, return to original state, Hey, are eliminated, Skma with Makron, subtle. These klesas are subtle, they are destroyed when the mind dissolves back into its original matrix. Vyasa's only comment here is that when the mind of the yogi has fulfilled its purpose, that is, when the yogi has attained a permanent state of nirbhaja, samadhi, it dissolves back into prakti. As Akara puts it, no fire is needed for something that has already been burned, nor grinding mortar for what has already been ground. The mind, having fulfilled its objectives, becomes redundant. The 5 klesas are lodged in the mind. Consequently, becoming like burnt seeds as discussed above, they too dissolve along with it. Patanjali in Sutra 2.4 referred to only 4 possible states for the klesas: dormant, weak, intermittent, or fully activated, but we recall that Vyasa in his commentary for that sutra mentioned that the burnt state constituted a 5th state. Vaikaspati Misra suggests that in the sutra Patanjali is indirectly confirming that 5th state. This is a good example of how Vyasa's commentary has become almost as canonical as Patanjali's original text. It is almost never questioned by all subsequent commentators, but reinforced. The task of the traditional exegete is not to probe if an authoritative text is true, but how it is true. Like burnt seeds, klesas do not disappear as long as the mind of the yogi is still active. They remain embedded there but in their burnt state, like an empty shell, with their potency to sprout or produce effects, unwanted vittas, terminated. Their total dissolution occurs only when the mind of the liberated yogi dissolves back into its original praktic source upon the yogi's death, pratiprasava. One might mention here that in the yoga metaphysics of Satkaryavada, matter cannot be totally destroyed, it can only transform. 22 Hariharananda states that the difference between the burnt seed state of the klesas and their total dissolution along with the mind into prakti corresponds to the difference between samprajanata and asamprajanata, samadhis. In the former state, the mind is still active. Even the enlightened wisdom saskra that I am not this body is nonetheless a thought of the mind. In this sense, it is a vitti and therefore has a form similar to any vitti, including its opposite, the unenlightened thought, I am this body. The difference between them is that the former is a kliya, beneficial to the goal of yoga, and the latter kliya, detrimental, I. 5. In the same way, a burnt or parched seed still has a form that is similar to a normal seed. The difference is that one produces fruit and the other does not. However, there is always the possibility of even a burnt or parched seed unexpectedly sprouting, says Vijanabhikkhu, so it is not until after the death of the yogi who has attained asamprajanata, samadhi, that the mind completely dissolves along with the klesas and thus completely ceases to function as a mind with no possibility of capturing the awareness of purua and of again producing misidentification, rebirth, and sasrik existence. In samprajanata, samadhi, says Hariharananda, there is still the sense of I, a faint trace of personal ego, asmita, and thus the mind, along with its klesas, is still not ready to dissolve away completely. 2. 11 Dhyana, Hay is tad, Vitaya Dhyana, meditation, Hay, eliminated, tad, there the klesas, Vitaya, changing states of mind. The states of mind produced by these klesas are eliminated by meditation. We had suggested at the beginning of the chapter that the relationship of yoga defined in I. 2 as Siddha, Viti, Nara, with Kriya, yoga as defined in 2. 1, is that by the former the vittas are weakened, and by the latter the klesas or mechanisms underpinning the production of the vittas are eliminated. By the phrase tad, vitaya, Patanjali here confirms that the klesas produce the vittas. They are thus a deeper element of the psyche and unavoidably need to be confronted if one wishes to nara the vittas produced by them, as I.2 requires the yogi to do. Patanjali indicated in 2 that the klesas are destroyed by kriya, yoga, yet here he states that the vittas produced by them are destroyed by meditation, dhyana. Vyasa clarifies that the seed power, or fructifying ability, of the klesas is weakened by the practice of kriya, yoga, and then eradicated by the practice of meditation, 23, until they become like burnt seeds. He gives the useful example of washing garments. Gross dirt is first removed from soiled clothes, and then efforts are directed at the finer dirt. In the same way, the gross manifestations of the klesas can be easily removed by kriya, yoga, but the more subtle ones require greater efforts. The commentators understand the process of eradicating the klesas as a threefold sequence. First, the cloth is cleaned by shaking it in the air or washing it in water, and this removes the larger chunks of dirt. It is then washed more carefully by adding a cleaning agent or beating it against a stone, as is still the custom in India, and this removes the finer, more ingrained dirt. But to completely and absolutely remove all subtle impressions of the soiled spots, says Ramananda Sarasvati, you ultimately have to destroy the cloth itself. Likewise, the grosser aspects of the klesis are eliminated by kriya, yoga, the more subtle aspects by meditation, but, as indicated by the last sutra, the actual burnt seeds, or residual impressions of the now impotent saskaras, are not completely dissolved until the mind, along with all its latent saskaras, merges back into its matrix at the death of the yogi who has attained the highest state of samadhi. 2. 12 Klisa, Mlakarmaseo with Makrandi ta, Janma, Vedanya Klisa, impediments, Mla, root, Karma, actions, Aya, deposit, stock, Da, seen, Ada, unseen, Janma, birth, Vedanya, is experienced. The stock of karma has the klesis as its root. It is experienced in present or future lives. Vyasa states that the deposit, or stock of karma mentioned by Patanjali here, the karma, asaya, is produced from kama, labha, moha, and krodha, desire, greed, delusion, and anger. Vyasa appears to be using a variant set of terms overlapping the klesis, perhaps taken from the Gita, for example, 16:21. Desire and its uncontrolled form of greed are ultimately the klesis of attachment, and its flip side, aversion, which stem from the klesis of ego and ignorance. Anger is the frustration of this desire or attachment, Gita 2:62-63, and delusion is a manifestation of the klesa of ignorance. Vyasa then discusses varieties of karma, good and bad, and its fructification. The examples Vyasa gives of good karma include performing austerities, chanting mantras, cultivating samadhi, and worshipping Isvara or the great sages, with enthusiasm and determination. Such activities bear fruit in this lifetime. He illustrates bad karma as harmful activities directed against the fearful, infirm, or helpless, those who have placed faith in oneself, the noble-minded, or those performing austerities. If these activities are performed intensely, they can bear their fruits during the present life. Vyasa illustrates the instant fructification of good karma by referring to the youth Nandisvara, whose human form was transformed into a celestial one in that very life, due to his intense performance of pious activities. He illustrates the immediate fructification of bad karma by the story of Nawa, who was cursed by a sage to immediately abandon his celestial form as Indra and assume the form of a snake in the earthly realms due to his arrogance. Neither of these individuals had to undergo the normal process of old age and death but experienced their just fruits instantly. Similarly, the Bhagavata, X. 10, tells the story of two celestials who were cursed to become trees in the courtyard of Ka's family home due to offending sage Narada with their shameless licentious behavior. Baby Ka pulls down the two trees by dragging a mortar behind him that becomes wedged between them, and the two celestials are immediately released from their curse and regain their celestial forms. Whether good or bad, all karma is stored or imprinted as saskara in the siddha and, in general, may manifest its fruits in either this life or the next. Activities are virtuous or non-virtuous and produce corresponding fruits. In the next sutra, Patanjali states that the particulars of one's life, the type of birth, quality of life experience, and lifespan are all the fruits or results of one's karma. But the fruits of karma ultimately have the klesas as their root, mula. It is these klesas that influence one to act in good or bad ways. Therefore, there is a vicious cycle. Klesas provokes karma, and karma fuels the klesas. Vaikaspati Misra gives a few examples of how the desire, greed, delusion, and anger noted by Vyasa might produce either bad or good karma. Desire can obviously produce bad karma when one performs impious acts out of avarice, such as stealing another person's property, but desire can also produce good karma, as when one performs pious acts motivated by a desire to enjoy the rewards of piety. Bad karma caused by anger, says Vaikaspati Misra, hardly needs exemplification: murder of the righteous, etc. But there are also instances when anger produces good karma. Here he refers to the famous Puran.ic story of Prince Dhruva, a child devotee of Vayu, Bhagavata Pura 4. 9, 12 ff. Once, Dhruva attempted to climb onto his father's lap but was rebuked by his co-mother, who wanted her own son, Dhruva's half-brother, to be the king's favorite and eventual successor to the throne. Offended that his father did not step in when he was humiliated in this way, Dhruva determined in anger to gain a kingdom greater than his father's. Upon asking his own mother to advise him as to who might help him achieve his ends, she told him that he should worship Vayu, since Vayu can bestow any boon. Even though the boy was only 5 years old, and even though the great sage Narada tried to dissuade him on account of the perils and hardships of the forest where he was heading, the boy persisted and performed intense austerities with his mind fixed on Vayu. Eventually, as a result of concentrating his mind so exclusively on the Supreme Lord in this way, Vayu appeared to him and Dhruva was purified and received immeasurable boons, both material and spiritual. The point is that even though Dhruva worshipped Vayu out of anger at the offense he had suffered, his mind was completely fixed without deviation on Isvara, and from this perspective created good karma, although a vision of Vayu is, of course, an act of grace and beyond the jurisdiction of any mundane laws of karma. A verse in the Bhagavata Pura states that those who always dedicate their desire, anger, fear, affection, sense of identity, and friendship to Harika, enter for certain into his state of being, X. 29.15. According to the Bhagavata, the highest meditation and goal of life is total absorption in God, even if this is generated out of animosity, as was the case with Kesa, who, along with other demoniac adversaries of Ka, attained liberation simply by virtue of their minds being fixed undeviatingly on God, albeit in animosity. The text states, the king of the Satis, Sisupala, attained perfection despite hating Ka. What then of those dear to him? X. 29.13. The bottom line for the Bhagavata is a samadhi with the mind fixed exclusively on Ka as Isvara, whether in anger and hatred, or in a mood of intense desire and love, as with the gopi cowherd, women, all qualities which, under any other circumstances, would be considered klesas. Returning to Vyasa's list, delusion can generate bad karma, as in the case of taking the life of another under the belief that doing so is a virtuous act, but delusion, according to Vaikaspati Misra, does not beget good karma. However, even here, one might think of instances where delusion provokes a positive outcome in Puric narratives. Bali, the king of the demons, for example, was deluded by Vayu, who appeared before him in the form of a Brahmana boy Vamana, and tricked him out of his lordship of the three worlds. Yet the episode ends in Bali's upliftment, c4. 2-4. Story, since he attained pure devotion to Vayu, Isvara. 24. Vijanabhiku notes that the laws of karma apply only when they are performed out of ego, which, we recall, Patanjali defines as confounding the true Purua self with the mind and body. He quotes the Gita, where Ka is encouraging the despondent warrior Arjuna to fight a righteous war out of a sense of duty rather than out of concern for the outcome that might result for him personally. One whose intelligence is not tainted by ego, though he kills people in this world, does not kill, nor is he bound by his actions. 18. 17. Hariharananda provides the following useful synopsis of the workings of karma. Any state of mind leaves an imprint of itself on the siddha, and, as we know, this imprint is called a saskara. Imprints of good and bad karma produce an accumulation of saskaras called the karmasaya, or stock of karma. 2. 12. These saskaras are either born from the klesas, or are not, those produced out of ignorance are born from the klesas, but those resulting from true understanding are not, such as the Terminator Saskra of I. 50. It is the former category of Saskras born from the Klesas, whether pious, impious, or mixed in nature, that produces the store of karma, the karmasaya. This store of karma then fructifies and brings about the threefold conditions of one's life that are the subject of the next sutra. The time it takes for the seeds of karma to fructify whether in this life or a future one depends on the intensity of the original saskra. 2. 13 Sathi mule tad, vipako jati, aur, bhagsathi, when in existence, mule, the root, tad, its, vipka, fruition, jati, birth, age, span of life, bhag, experience as long as the root of the Klesas exists. It fructifies as type of birth, span of life, and life experience of an individual. Vyasa dedicates a long commentary to the sutra. He begins by reiterating that karma can bear fruit only when the Klesas exist. Just as grains of rice can germinate only when they are not burnt and when they are connected with the husk, and not when the seeds are burnt or removed from their husks, so karma cannot fructify when burnt or removed from its husk or its root, mula, of the Klesas. As long as the Klesas remain active, all the pious and impious actions born of them during one's lifetime, karma, whether dominant or subordinate, combine at the time of death and determine one's next life. In other words, at the moment of death, the accumulated karmasaya, or storehouse of karma, determines and establishes the three fruits, type of birth, jati, human, animal, etc. Lifespan, ayus, and life experience. Bhaga, the aggregate of pleasure and pain that one will experience. This store of karma, Vyasa adds, containing the impressions of deeds, saskras, performed throughout countless previous lives, is like a fishing net covered with knots, and the entire collective determines one's future birth. At death, says Vijanabhiku, the subtle body, or siddha, which is where the karmasaya and all the saskras are stored, transfers into the new body. The subtle body is not destroyed at death as the gross body is, and thus saskras are preserved from life to life. Now, whereas some karma contained in the karmasaya fructifies in the very next life, not all karma is destined to do so. Some karma might be mutually exclusive with other karma and not be able to coexist in the same life, says Akara. For example, one might have some karma that merits a celestial birth and other karma that requires an animal birth for fruition. Clearly those two sets of saskras require distinct births in which to fructify. In general, the cluster of karma that does not fructify in the next life, says Vyasa, may undergo three possible outcomes: it can be destroyed, it can merge with more dominant karma, or it can remain dormant for a long time, overshadowed by more powerful karma. The destruction of such dormant karma, if it is bad, occurs by the performance of good karma, such as yoga, related activities, and this can be accomplished even in this lifetime, adds Vyasa. He substantiates this with a verse: of the two types of known karma, one is bad, but it can be destroyed by deeds that are good. Therefore desire to perform good deeds in this world. 25 On the other hand, although good karma can destroy bad karma, the reverse does not hold true: bad karma cannot destroy good karma. But bad karma can merge with good as per the second outcome noted by Vyasa above and cause some slight diminution or interference in enjoying the fruits of good karma, such as indigestion after the pleasure of a good meal, says Vijanabhiku. As for the third option, lying dormant, not all karma is destined to activate in the next life, and so the balance lies dormant until the appropriate conditions manifest for it to fructify, unless, as outlined above, it is destroyed by good karma, or merges with more powerful good karma in the interim. Hariharananda gives the example of a man who performed pious deeds as a boy, but due to greed he acted like a beast as he grew older. The beastly acts he performed as an adult developed into the dominant karma for that particular lifetime, determining that his next life would be that of a beast. His earlier pious karma performed as a boy, which required a human form in which to fructify, would meanwhile lie dormant during his life as a beast until the appropriate conditions manifest for it to activate in a future birth as a human. This means that at the moment of death, the particular cluster of saskras destined to fructify in the next life arise like a wave, according to Vaikaspati Misra, and not only propel the siddha into the next body but also determine the specific mind set of that body. Thus, the portion of beastly saskras of a person during the period when he or she was thinking and acting in a beastly manner, which require an animal birth as karmic consequence, reactivate in the mind and solidify into a beastly mind, set for the corresponding period as an animal. Meanwhile, the portion of human saskras remains dormant until it is its turn to fructify in a life requiring a human mind, set and birth. Since the time and place of the conditions surrounding the fruition of karma are so complex that they cannot be fathomed, the unfolding of karma, says Vyasa, is mysterious. As Ka states, difficult to understand are the ways of karma, Gita 4:17. Vaikaspati Misra notes that, ultimately, the store of karma results in pleasure and pain. After all, the type of birth, life experience, and lifespan mentioned by Patanjali in the sutra basically correspond to experiences of pleasure and pain. And pleasure and pain inevitably produce a mutually dependent relationship with the klesas of attachment and aversion, the latter are dependent on the former. Nor can attachment and aversion exist without producing pleasure and pain. Acting out of attachment, for example, will produce pleasure if the object of attachment is available, or, if it is unobtainable or fails to live up to expectations, pain, likewise with aversion. Therefore, says Vaikaspati Misra, the mind can become a fertile field for the karmasaya only when it is watered by the klesas. Conversely, the karmasaya becomes impotent when the klesas are destroyed. Hence Patanjali calls the klesas the root of worldly existence. Vijanabhika quotes various verses pointing to attachment as the cause of karma and hence of rebirth. Being attached, a person, along with his karma, attains the result of that to which his mind is attached. Bhadrayaka Upaniyad 4.6. The Purua soul, situated in Prakti matter, experiences the guas born of Prakti. It is attachment to these guas that is the cause of a person's birth in pious or impious wombs, Gita 13:21. Birth is not seen for one who has no attachment, Nyaya Sutras 3:1.24. Of course, attachment itself comes from ego, which in turn comes from ignorance, hence the ordering of the klesas in Patanjali's list in 2:3. When knowledge arises, Vijanabhika says, two results accrue. We know that ignorance is destroyed and so the klesas are deprived of their base, and thus further karma is no longer generated. But additionally, already existing karma generated previously that is not due to manifest in this life, the sansita, karma, collection or store of karma lying latent, is burned, since karma can exist only where the klesas exist. He quotes the Gita again, the learned call that person wise whose karma is burned by the fire of knowledge. Knowledge, 4:19. Vijanabhika points out that the texts all speak of karma being burned, not destroyed, since nothing can be destroyed. Karma is fully dissolved only when the mind, where karma is lodged, is itself dissolved back into its praktic matrix after the death of the enlightened yogi. While the enlightened yogi is still alive, says Vijanabhika, he experiences only the karma that has already begun to fructify, called prarabdha, karma. When the siddha is transferred from one body to another, it brings its residual karma with it, only some of which is destined to bear its fruit in that birth. Once this next life begins, this portion of karma relevant to this birth is called the prarabdha, karma. If a person becomes enlightened in that life, all the other residual dormant karma that had not been activated for that life, the sansita, karma, is destroyed, and, of course, no ongoing karma, sansi yamana karma, is being generated since the klesas of an already liberated but still embodied yogi are destroyed. when ignorance, the first klesa and support of the other klesas, is destroyed upon enlightenment. Therefore, an enlightened yogi experiences only the prarabdha, karma already activated and set in motion for this lifetime, and thus may still be subject to, for example, illness or injury. Such a yogi is called a jivanmutta, embodied but liberated, and does not return to sasra after death. The Sakyakarika dedicates a specific verse to this phenomenon. Upon attaining complete enlightenment, the embodied self remains subject to embodiment for the balance of that life because of the force of past saskras, like a potter's wheel. The potter's wheel does not immediately come to a stop when the potter stops turning it, it slows gradually due to the force already invested in it. Or, as per the illustration used in the Vedanta tradition, the archer has no control over the arrow that has already been discharged, it will rest only when its momentum is exhausted. 1.15. Or, in more modern terms, if we pull the plug of a fan out of its socket such that no further electric current is entering the appliance, it does not immediately come to a standstill, it needs to use up the energy already transmitted to it. Likewise, even as no further karma is being produced by the yogi and all latent karma is destroyed, the karma already activated for this life nonetheless has to run its course. 2. 14 te hlata, paratapa, vulpuipwaya, hitadvat te, these type of birth, span of life, and life experience, hlata, pleasure, paratapa, pain, full, fruits, pwaya, virtue, apwaya, vice, hitadvat, as a result of these the type of birth, span of life, and life experience bear the fruits of pleasure and pain, as a result of the performance of virtue and vice. This sutra states that vice, apwaya, bad karma, produces a short lifespan and distressful, paratapa, type of birth and life experience, virtue, pwaya, good karma, produces pleasurable, hlata, experiences. So the klesas provoke karma, and karma, depending on its nature, produces different qualities of births, lifespans, and life experiences, and these in turn produce corresponding pleasure and pain. Vijnanabhika reminds us that pleasure and pain exist in experience, and any experience is ultimately the result of the false identification of oneself with the body and its senses. Therefore, the klesas of ego and ignorance always remain the ultimate root cause of all suffering. And even so, called pleasure can be seen as suffering from an ultimate perspective, since it is temporary and there is always some type of pain or undesirable element mixed in with every pleasurable situation. Vyasa, anticipating the next sutra, notes that a yogi sees suffering even in what others would consider pleasurable situations. As for the jivanmuttas, says Vijnanabhiku, since they are free from ignorance and ego, they experience only the pleasure and pain of the karma that has already started to fructify. They have extinguished attachments and desires and so do not produce fresh karma. He quotes the Bhadrayaka Upanishad, if one knows oneself as this I.e. the pure Atman self, then desiring what, and for the sake of whom, will one identify with this body? 4.12. 2. 15 Parama, Tapa, Saskra, Tukurgwa, Viti, Vrayaksya Tuksameva Sarvavivkana Parama, result, consequence, change, Tapa, distress, Saskra, mental impression, Tuke, as a result of the pains, Kwa, qualities, influences, Viti, fluctuating states of mind, Vrayat, conflict, Ca, and Tuksam, suffering, Eva, indeed, Sarvam, everything, Vivkana, one who has discrimination for one who has discrimination, everything is suffering on account of the suffering produced by the consequences of action, by pain itself, and by the saskras, as well as on account of the suffering ensuing from the turmoil of the vitas due to the kwas. Patanjali here makes a seemingly radical statement that everything is seen as dukkha, suffering, by the wise. In the previous sutra, He noted that pious activities produced hlada, pleasure, but lest anyone take this to indicate that the pursuit of pleasure through piety be a fitting goal of life, he here informs us that even the so-called pleasure of prakti is only deemed pleasure relative to more obvious forms of paritapa, pain. To the vivkan, one who has vivka, discrimination, all is suffering, even the so-called hlada of good birth, experiences, and lifespan mentioned in the last sutra. Indeed, hlada is particularly insidious and especially perpetuates sasra, since it is the memories of pleasure that propel people to try to create and re-experience that pleasure, and thus get caught in the vicious cycle of karma that perpetuates sasra. The term vivka, discrimination, comes from the root vik, to separate. Vivkan is the possessor of vivka. 26. Thus, those possessing discrimination, the wise, can separate purua from prakti. To discriminate entails distinguishing between different entities. Hence they can discriminate that even the hlada described in the previous sutra belongs to the world of prakti and is therefore, from an ultimate perspective, actually dukkha. A better translation of dukkha than suffering might be, in my view, frustration, since suffering often has physical connotations, and, in addition to referring to physical pain, dukkha, perhaps even primarily, is the frustration that follows from the attempt to find permanent satisfaction in objects of the senses and mind that are by their very nature temporary. This perception of the world as a place of frustration is fairly ubiquitous in the yogic traditions. The first noble truth of Buddhism, sarvatuksam, all is suffering, consists of the exact same terms adopted by Patanjali. Indeed, the other three noble truths are predicated upon the first, that there is a cause of this suffering, that there is a possibility of putting an end to suffering, and that there is a path to accomplish the removal of suffering. Thus the Buddhist path is based on a perception that the world that is, the world as experienced under the influence of ignorance, is a place of suffering. Patanjali makes the same claim. In fact, most of the soteriological systems of ancient India shared this perception. As early as the Bhadrayaka Upanishad we find that, other than the Atman, everything else is grief. 3. 4.2, and the Gita calls the world Dukkalayam as a svatam, a place of suffering which is temporary. 8. 15. The Sakyakarika state in the very first verse, because of the torment of the threefold dukkha discussed below, the desire to know the means of counteracting them arises. 1. In the Nyaya Sutras, dukkha is one of the 9 objects of right knowledge, and liberation is defined as the removal of suffering. 1.9, 22. Similarly, the very definition of yoga in the Vaiyaka Sutras is the elimination of dukkha. V. 16. 27. This sutra is actually the pivot of this chapter, which, in turn, is the heart of the entire text. Verses 1-14 discuss the causes, the klesas, that produce dukkha, and verses 16 onward focus on the path to remove dukkha as well as the state beyond. The chapter thus echoes the 4 noble truths. One might ask, without an experience of the world as frustrating on some level, what would motivate one to seek fulfillment elsewhere and take up the rigors and challenges of the yoga path? If one perceives the world of experience as a jolly fine place in which to be, why would one wish to seek a higher truth? From this perspective, a recognition of the world as a place of suffering is actually a preliminary realization for the path of yoga, or, it might be argued, for any serious spiritual practice, as indicated in the Sakyakarika's quote above. Vyasa sets out to examine the nature of suffering and its apparent opposite, pleasure. Pleasure, says Vyasa, means attachment to the objects that give pleasure, whether inanimate objects or living beings. It is this attachment to pleasure that motivates action, and, as we know, action produces the karmasaya, the store of action, that is, the cycle of reaction inherent in karma. Aversion to suffering is the flip side of this, the attempt to avoid the objects that cause suffering. Therefore, it is attachment and aversion that produce the karmasaya. More specifically, pleasure is the appeasement that occurs when the senses are gratified with the objects of enjoyment, and suffering the lack of such appeasement, in other words, the agitation that results from unfulfilled desire. However, Vyasa points out that the senses are never really freed from hankering by repeated indulgence, because such indulgence simply increases the attachment to pleasure as well as the demands of the senses. One remains even more dissatisfied than before. The Gita considers lust the eternal enemy, insatiable as fire. 3:39. The more fuel one pours on a fire, the stronger it burns. Therefore, indulgence is not the means to gain ultimate pleasure, and one who gets addicted to sense pleasure ends up immersed in dissatisfaction and in the sense enmeshed in frustration. This is the frustration born of consequences, parama, the first type of suffering on Patanjali's list. Parama also means change, transformation, as well as consequences, and can be read as pointing to the ever-changing nature of everything. From this perspective, the experience of any happiness, even our Kodak moments, which appear so satisfying at the moment of experience, are changing or temporary by nature. Hence, when the pleasurable moment inevitably passes, the sense of frustration is enhanced. Therefore the yogi, says Vyasa, sees suffering inherent even in the moment of pleasure. Vaikaspati Misra continues this theme by pointing out that attachment to pleasure is itself a source of pain because one is never satisfied with what one has but constantly craves additional objects of pleasure. And on the occasions when one gains possession of such perceived sources of pleasure, one finds that they do not provide the anticipated satisfaction, and thus one craves more or different objects. The Manava, Dharma, Sastra 2:8 makes the observation that desire is never extinguished by the enjoyment of what is desired, it just grows stronger, like a fire that flares up with the ablation of butter. 2:94. This constant hankering for more enjoyment is itself suffering. Vaikaspati Misra cites a similar verse in the Gita, happiness derived from the contact of the senses appears like nectar in the beginning, but in the end becomes like poison. Such happiness is born from rajas. Like honey mixed with poison, he says, there is always suffering inherent as a consequence of pleasure. Indeed, there is always suffering mixed in with the actual experience of pleasure itself. The suffering of pain, tapa, the second type of suffering listed in the sutra, is identified by Vyasa as the three standard sources of suffering identified in traditional texts. Tapa here refers to involuntary pain experienced by the mind and senses, in contrast to the spiritual practice of tapa as an ingredient of kriya, yoga or the niyamas, where it refers to the voluntary control of the senses. These three are adhyatmika, adhibhotika, and adhidavika, suffering produced by one's own body and mind, such as illness, injury, insecurity, or anxiety, suffering produced by other beings, such as mosquitoes, enemies, obnoxious neighbors, even one's own sometimes troublesome family members and loved ones, and suffering produced by nature and the environment, such as storms or earthquakes. Through body, speech, and mind, a person tries to avoid distressful situations and instead attain the means of pleasure. A small amount of suffering is felt more than an abundance of pleasure, says Vijanabhiku. And so aversion to pain is stronger than desire for pleasure. Therefore, people pray to God that their happiness be perpetuated and suffering be avoided. A further result of the pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain, says Vyasa, is that it inevitably causes one to harm others in this endeavor, even if some benefit, and thus binds one to accumulate merit and demerit, karma. He states that pleasure can be attained only at some direct or indirect cost of harm to others, and thus the seeds of aggression are added to one's store of karma. Even in such seemingly innocuous activities as preparing food and cleaning, violence is performed against other living creatures. Tiny creatures are harmed unknowingly in the performance of household chores, as Vaikaspati Misra illustrates with another well-known verse from Manu, 3:69, that the householder must atone for the 5 slaughterhouses of the household, the fireplace, fireplace, the grindstone, the broom, the mortar, and the pestle. 29 Sanskaras, subliminal impressions. The next item mentioned by Patanjali as a source of suffering, are, as we know, the latent imprints deposited in the mind of every past experience of pleasure and suffering. When these ripen as karma and fructify, one again experiences pleasure and suffering. The desire for pleasure and aversion to pain trigger these latent sanskaras, which fructify and become memories of past pleasures or pains. These memories generate fresh craving or aversion, the desire to recreate past pleasurable experiences, or avoid known miseries. This is a form of mental torment or suffering. One is constantly lamenting the loss of past pleasures and hankering for the attainment of pleasures one does not at present have. Additionally, of course, inspired by such memories, a person acts, producing further experiences, and these produce a new set of sanskaras that add to the accumulation of karma. Thus the river of karma, which, as Vyasa will argue next, is all ultimately suffering, swells continuously. Since one cannot experience the fruition of all this karma in one life, one is bound to experience it in future lives, and so the cycle of embodied existence, samsara, is perpetuated across lifetimes. This vicious cycle causes concern only to the yogi, however, who can recognize it as being a highly undesirable state of affairs. As the Buddha notes, what others call pleasure, sukha, the noble ones call dukkha. 30 A wise person cannot enjoy something sweet if he or she knows it will eventually cause sickness, says Akara. A yogi is as sensitive as an eyeball. If a strand of thread falls on the eyeball, says Vyasa, it causes distress, but if it falls on any other part of the body, it is hardly felt at all. Similarly, the pain of existence even in so-called situations of happiness troubles only the yogi, it does not trouble other people. Others, say the commentators, cannot see the long-term repercussions of activities that produce limited so-called happiness in the present. Consequently, they repeatedly experience the suffering accrued due to their karma, try to avoid the suffering and pursue happiness but, planting more seeds of karma, continue to re-experience it. This is rather like a person running away from a scorpion who gets bitten by a poisonous snake, says Vyasa. Everything is painful to the ignorant as well, says Vijanabhikkhu, but they do not realize it, whereas the yogi does. Vijanabhikkhu illustrates this with a verse from the Vyapara: there is more pain created for a person through spouse, friends, children, income, home, property, and wealth, etc. than there is pleasure. 6. 5.56. Thus, Patanjali notes that for a wise person, everything is called pain, rather than happiness mixed with pain. Also, fools realize their mistake upon attaining the consequences of the pursuit of pleasure after the event. Vyasa continues, whereas for the yogi, pain is evident at the very time of the experience of pleasure. Moreover, most people relate only to present pain, whereas the yogi is aware of past pain, which influences the present, and future pain, which is inherent in and a consequence of the present. One might give the example of a person who wakes up with a terrible hangover after a night of alcohol excess, swears he or she will never drink again, but, come the next weekend, is back at the bar, destined to awake with another hangover the next morning. The sanskaras of so-called pleasure produced from a night on the town are imprinted in one's siddha mind. When these reactivate, if one's desire to enjoy in this way is sufficiently strong, it overrides discernment, or the memory of the negative consequences, and one again feels the urge. Thus the cycle of attempting to find happiness but, instead, ultimately being subject to suffering, is perpetuated. The compulsion to experience happiness is so strong that one typically resigns oneself to the inevitable inconveniences that accompany it, under the rationalization, that's just life. For Carvaka, an ancient materialist philosopher, all the pleasures of life have some inconveniences, and one must simply tolerate them. In one of his well-known known quotes, the enjoyment of fish inevitably requires that one first remove the fish bones. 31 For yogis, of course, such an attitude perpetuates sasra, but there are other possibilities, namely, the freedom from all suffering, which is the nature of purua itself. The fourth item on Patanjali's list of the causes of suffering, being constantly subject to the citta, vitas, the agitations of the mind, refers to the fact that the mind is always changing, never peaceful or satisfied. This is because the guas, which constitute the citta, are always in flux, as Ka states in the Gita, 14:10. Depending on whether sattva, rajas, or tamas is dominant at any particular time, the mind temporarily experiences mundane, pairctic, happiness, distress, or illusion, respectively. But this very turmoil is ultimately a condition of suffering, since the mind craves continuous happiness. Vijanabhikkhu also quotes the Gita, "For those whose intelligence is not fixed in yoga, there is no peace, and how can there be real happiness without peace?" 2:66. As he points out, since any one of the guas is never exclusively present, when sattva is temporarily dominant and one experiences the pairctic happiness that is a characteristic of sattva, even then, rajas and tamas are also present to a subordinate degree. Therefore, this pairctic happiness is always mixed with some degree of pain, rajas, and dejection or illusion, tamas, just like the fruit of the haritaki tree contains at the same time all 6 tastes known to Hindu gastronomy: sweet, sour, salty, pungent, bitter, and astringent. And, besides, since the guas are always in flux, even one's mixed happy state eventually evaporates and one is plunged into a predominantly rajasic or tamasic state that is primarily distressful or dejected. Therefore, every state contains some degree of suffering, hence Patanjali's claim that all is suffering to the wise. These sources of pain and suffering all stem from ignorance, which is lack of discrimination, that is, being attached to mistaken notions of I and mind, considering the I to be the temporary body, senses, and fluctuating mind rather than pure awareness, and the mind to be one's spouse, children, and possessions, says Vaikaspati Misra. In this way, by attempting to find happiness through one's body, mind, relationships, and possessions, one perpetuates the cycle of birth and death. Vijanabhikkhu quotes the Bhagavata Purana, "Real happiness is to transcend mundane pleasure and distress," 11:19.45, and the means to do this is to remove all desire of the senses for the sense objects by ceasing to misidentify the real self with the sensual body. Seeing himself and all other beings caught up in this tide of suffering, says Vyasa, the yogi takes shelter of true knowledge that he is not the body or mind. Just as the science of medicine has 4 parts, he says disease to be removed, cause of disease, freedom from disease, and the means of removal, medicine, so the science of yoga has 4 parts: sasra, the cause of sasra, freedom from sasra, and the means of liberation. Sasra is the disease that is to be removed, its cause is the contact between purua and prakti, freedom from sasra is the cessation of this contact, liberation, and the means of removing this contact is pure knowledge. Akara quotes this fourfold division of Vyasa in the opening words of his Vivara commentary on the first sutra of the Yoga Sutras. The notion of life as suffering is clearly a pivotal tenet of the Yoga Sutras and certainly dominates the present section of the text. This fourfold schema can be correlated with the following sutras. Sutra 2:16 states that future suffering is to be avoided. 2:17 considers the cause of suffering, with 2:18-24 an extended discussion of its characteristics. 2:25 freedom from suffering, and 2:26 the means of attaining this freedom. This 4-part schema obviously echoes the 4 noble truths of Buddhism. 32 But Vijanabhikkhu reads Vyasa's understanding of these 4 truths as a rejection of the Buddhist view that considers liberation to be not the cessation of contact between purua and prakti but the giving up of the very notion of purua/Atman itself. In Buddhism, consciousness is the fifth and most subtle of five skandhas, aggregates, or ever fluctuating interdependent coverings that constitute personhood. In this system, consciousness is not an immutable and eternal entity that can be uncoupled from objects of consciousness, as in the orthodox Hindu view, but an ever-changing non-eternal layer that exists only in interdependent relation to objects of consciousness and not separately or autonomously from them. As has been discussed at length, the Yoga school holds that not only is consciousness, Atman/Purua, separate from the objects of consciousness, but the goal of the entire system is precisely for consciousness to be aware of itself as a separable, unchanging entity and thereby be extricated from its enmeshment in the world of objects. It is autonomous and independent. In contrast, liberation in Buddhism, nirvana, is attained precisely when one ceases to identify with consciousness as an eternal, unchanging self and realizes that consciousness depends on objects of consciousness and does not exist without them. Consciousness is not autonomous or independent, it is dependent or interdependent on its objects, the very opposite of the yoga position. In other words, whereas in yoga, one must identify with and strive to realize the Atman, in Buddhism, one must cease identifying with or clinging to the notion of and striving for the liberation of an Atman. Hence, in philosophical discourse, Buddhism is sometimes referred to as an Atmavada, the system that does not believe in an Atman. But, argues Vijñanabhikkhu, in order to reject something, there must be two entities, the rejecter and the thing to be rejected. If the notion of Atman becomes the thing to be rejected, who is the rejecter of the notion? Or, as Hariharananda puts it, if one aspires to liberation by thinking, let me be free from misery by suspending the activities of the mind, there will remain a pure me free from the pangs of misery. The self behind or beyond the mind is the real experiencer of this process. Suffering, dukkha, seems to have been coined by analogy to its opposite, sukha, happiness. Ka refers to the axle of a wagon, and su is a prefix denoting good, and du, bad. Thus in its old Indo-Aryan, Vedic usage, sukha denoted a wagon with good axles, that is, a comfortable ride. The Indo-Aryans were tribal cowherders, and one can imagine that comfortable wagons for their travels on the rough, unpaved trails of their day would have been a major factor in their notions of happiness and comfort. 2. 16 Hi tuksam anagatam hyam, to be avoided, tuksam, pain, suffering, anagatam, yet to come. Suffering that has yet to manifest is to be avoided. Past suffering has already been experienced, says Vyasa, and presently experienced suffering has already activated and is bearing its fruits. Therefore, only suffering accruing in the future, anagatam, can be avoided, hyam, and it is the suffering that is of concern to the yogi who Vyasa, in the last verse, considered as sensitive as an eyeball. How can one give up suffering that has yet to come, in other words, suffering that does not yet exist? Asks Vijñanabhikkhu rhetorically. By removing its cause, the subject of the next sutra. Just as the present is the result of previous causes, and was once that which had yet to come, so future suffering has its seeds in the present and past. There are examples of this everywhere, says Vijñanabhikkhu. The earth has the potential to give rise to many effects that are as yet unmanifest, but their seeds lie stored in the present. However, the absolute removal of future suffering can be attained only by liberation, say the commentators, removing the identification between Purua and Prakti. Again, this is the standard view. Gautama, the author of the Nyaya Sutras, states that relief from suffering comes only from liberation. I. 1.22. Likewise, Kata, the author of a series of sutras foundational to the Vaiyika school of philosophy, states that only when the mind is removed from its objects is one free from pain. V. 2.16. 2. 17dra, Di-io Sayagohaya, Hitudra, of the seer, Di-io, of the seen, Sayaga, conjunction, Heya, to be avoided, Hitu, the cause, the conjunction between the seer and that which is seen is the cause of suffering to be avoided. The seer, Dra, of this sutra, says Vyasa, is the Purua soul who cognizes through buddhi, intelligence. The discussion of the mind so far has generally focused on Siddha, which, we recall, consists of manas, the sorting and processing aspect of cognition, ahakara, the aspect of cognition underpinning self, identity and ego, and buddhi, intelligence, the discriminating aspect of the mind. The ensuing discussion will focus more specifically on buddhi. This is the aspect of Siddha immediately adjacent to the Purua, in the sense of being the first interface between the awareness of the Purua and the world of Prakrti and her effects, the first and most subtle covering, so to speak. Patanjali's reference to that which is seen, Daya, consists of all objects that present themselves to the intelligence. These objects act like magnets, attracting the awareness of Purua because of proximity. On account of seeing these objects, the Purua becomes like their master, says Vyasa, and, on account of being seen, the objects of experience become, as it were, the property of Purua, the seer, though they do not exist within Purua. Though different from and external to Purua, these objects as if take on the nature of Purua, becoming animated due to reflecting the consciousness of Purua. This beginningless association, sayaga, between these two is the cause of suffering that is to be avoided. Therefore, the absolute remedy for suffering is ceasing the association between Purua and intelligence. We see, continues Vyasa, that there are remedies for suffering in this world. For example, the sole of the foot is capable of being pierced, and the thorn of piercing it. The remedy is to remove the thorn from the foot, or, better still, not to put the foot on the thorn. Likewise, the remedy for the suffering of embodied existence is to remove Purua from its association with Prakrti. One who knows these three features, the locus of pain, the cause of pain, and the remedy for pain, need not undergo suffering. Vyasa further notes that on a metaphysical level, suffering is the result of rajas disturbing sattva. When undisturbed, sattva produces a type of happiness, it is rajas that causes suffering. Everyone has experienced that well-being, peace, and happiness are the result of moderation, says Hariharananda. When rajas activates and one becomes overactive, overindulgent or hyper-energetic, one's peace of mind is destroyed and is replaced by suffering, either mental, in the form, say, of incessant anxiety or craving, or physical, in the form, say, of ulcers, indigestion, or sexual disease. Likewise, if tamas activates and inertia sets in, one cannot feel satisfied or self-content at all. Since the natural state of the mind is sattva, it is rajas and tamas that are the disruptors. When sattva is disrupted, suffering is the result. When the Purua's awareness pervades the sattva disrupted by rajas and tamas, continues Vyasa, it becomes aware of this suffering. However, the suffering is not actually located in the Purua, which is changeless and actionless, it is located in the buddhi, intelligence, whose pure sattva nature is being disturbed by rajas. Vaikaspati Misra elaborates on this, the intelligence is molded by the objects of the senses, sound, etc., and takes on their characteristics, like liquid copper takes on the form of the mold into which it is poured. The intelligence is thus transformed by input transmitted through the senses. The awareness of Purua pervades the intelligence and is misidentified with it by the mind, or more precisely, by the klesas in the mind. Thus Purua becomes aware of intelligence in whatever forms it is molded into by the objects of the senses. Since intelligence is inert and animated only by the consciousness of Purua, if this connection between Purua and buddhi is not made, the knowable cannot be known, objects cannot be experienced. It is due to the conjunction between the two that the consciousness of Purua can become aware of this transformed buddhi, and through it all the objects of experience. Due to being pervaded by Purua, the states of buddhi are assigned to Purua by the mind. If the state of Buddhi is of undisturbed sattva, it appears as if the Purua is happy, and if of sattva disturbed by rajas and tamas, it appears as if Purua is suffering. Either way, neither state is ultimately an actual state of Purua, but of the intelligence and mind with which Purua is misidentified. Pleasure and pain, in and of themselves, are unconscious characteristics of Buddhi. It is only when they are pervaded by the conscious self that I am happy or I am sad becomes a conscious state of awareness. Experience of pain is just experience of Buddhi, the intelligence, says Vijanabhikkhu, not of anything actually transpiring in Purua itself. But due to ignorance, one thinks that Purua is in pain. Purua, says Vyasa, is changeless and actionless, it is the subject, and pain can reside only as an object. Pain is an object of experience. Vijanabhikkhu gives the example of water on a leaf. The water does not change the leaf even though there is contact between them, their properties are different. Likewise, the ever-changing states of the Buddhi do not change consciousness even though there is conjunction between them, the properties of Purua and Prakti are different. But, Vyasa adds, even the wise must work to rid themselves of this identification with pain caused by conjunction between the two. Vaikaspati Misra raises the issue of whether the relationship between Purua and the intelligence is innate or coincidental. It cannot be innate, he says, since then it would never cease to exist and thus there would be no hope of liberation, so it must be coincidental. However, this conjunction between these two entities must have existed eternally. This is because the mind is the product of karma and the klesas, etc. But karma and the klesas can exist only if the mind is there as their substratum. Like the chicken and the egg, one cannot come into being without the other. Therefore, as with all other Indic soteriological schools, yoga avoids this dilemma by positing that they must be beginningless. Since the mind, with its inherent karmas and klesas, exists only for fulfilling the purpose of Purua, the conjunction between mind and Purua must also be beginningless by a similar logic. At the end of each creation cycle, 33 the mind with its karmas and klesas dissolves into Prakti to be reactivated at the beginning of the next cycle in the same state in which it was found at the end of the previous cycle, just as the earth becomes parched after the summer season but springs back into life after the rainy season, before eventually becoming parched again. While one might question Vaikaspati Misra's logic, 34 as a point of information, no Indic school of thought considers speculation into how the soul originally became enmeshed in Sasra to be fruitful embodied existence is considered to have been eternal in terms of its origins. But, as Hariharananda notes, just because this conjunction is beginningless does not mean that it has to be endless. How it began is a question that cannot be answered and thus is fruitless to pose. 35 But inquiring how it can be ended is the goal of human life. It can be terminated by yoga. Actually, this conjunction between Purua and Prakti is brought about by Isvara, says Vijanabhikkhu, presenting the theistic perspective. It cannot be understood by even the best of yogis, nor by the process of logic. He quotes the Bhagavatapura, the bondage and pitiful circumstance of the independent and free soul goes against all logic, such is the Maya potency of the Lord. 3. 7.9. 36. 2. 18 Prakesa, Kriya, Sthiti, La Bhutendra Yatmakam Bhagpavargradadayam Prakesa, illumination, Kriya, activity, Sthiti, inertia, Silam, having the nature of Buddha, elements, Indriya, senses, Atmakam, having the nature of Bhaga, experience, Apavarga, liberation, Artham, object, purpose, Dayam, the knowable that which is knowable has the nature of illumination, activity, and inertia Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. It consists of the senses and the elements, and exists for the purpose of providing either liberation or experience to Purua. Patanjali here describes the ultimate metaphysical ingredients of the scene, Ksayam, the manifest world, and states its ultimate purpose for existing. The commentators correlate the illumination, Prakesa, noted here with sattva, the light inherent in buddhi, activity, kriya, with rajas, all movement and effort, and inertia, sthiti, with tamas. 37 These three gunas are always in flux, as long as the world is manifest. 38 And their nature is to assert themselves in various proportions and then ebb away, thus giving rise to the ever-changing world of manifest forms. Although one or the other of the three gunas appears dominant and the others secondary at any given moment, the presence of the secondary gunas can always be detected. This never-ending flux is what is called the known, says Vyasa, and it transforms itself into both the elements and the senses, Bhutendra Yatmakam. Bhutendra Yatmakam. As the former, it manifests subtly as the elements of sound, etc. and grossly as the elements of earth, etc. As the latter, it manifests subtly as hearing, and also as intelligence and ego, etc. Hariharananda correlates sattva with the knowledge or awareness aspect of any entity, such as a tree's impulse toward the source of light, rajas as the factors that cause any activity or motion, such as a tree's growth toward the source of light, and tamas as when any potentiality is retained or stored, such as the winter season for trees, when sap descends to the roots and is stored, or hibernation for animals. As noted, these gunas pervade all manifest reality, whether of the nature of graha, the instruments or organs of cognition such as the ear, or grahaya, the objects of cognition such as sound. Everything other than the purua itself is composed of these three gunas. The sattvic aspect of the ear, for example, says Hariharananda, manifests when it makes sound known. Its arajasic aspect is represented by the ear's nervous impulse excited by vibration, and the tamasic aspect, by the energy stored in its nerves and muscles. And sound itself has a knowledge, bestowing aspect, which is sattva, a vibrational aspect, which is rajas, and a stored energy aspect, which is the tamas element. Patanjali makes the important statement here that the purpose of these gunas, and thus of their praktic productions, is to provide either experience, bhaga, or liberation, apavarga, for the purua, as indicated also in the Skikarika, 17, XXI. Experience, says Vyasa, consists of occupying oneself with the desirable and undesirable nature of the gunas as discussed in 2:14. In other words, with pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain, while liberation entails the realization by purua of its own true nature. There is no other reason for the existence of prakti. Vyasa then raises a very important question: how can either the experience or liberation noted in this sutra be imposed on purua when they are the constructs and products of buddhi and exist only in buddhi and not in purua itself? Or, as Akara puts it, how can the deeds of one person be the work of another? The laundryman is not the dyer of clothes. Although experience and liberation are concepts of intelligence, says Vyasa, they are attributed to the purua because the purua experiences their fruit, just as the victory and defeat of soldiers are attributed to their chief, even though he may only be witnessing the battle, because he experiences the fruits of victory or defeat. Perception, memory, deliberation, critical reasoning, knowledge of the truth, determination, and, indeed, any cognitive functioning, all of which in actual fact are existing in buddhi, are superimposed on purua, continues Vyasa. As long as the awareness of purua remains focused on and is erroneously identified with buddhi and its manifestations, purua remains as if bound by that connection. But bondage is a state of mind, a product of buddhi, not an actual condition of purua, and it exists only for as long as the real goal of purua is not realized. Liberation is when that goal is attained, namely, the uncoupling of purua and buddhi by the mind. It, too, is a state of mind, or, put differently, the state of purua after the mind has eliminated its own klesas and ceased to superimpose itself onto consciousness. Vaikaspati Misra etymologizes the term for liberation, apavarga, as apa, plus vj, prefix plus verbal root, that which is separated from something else. expanding on the notions that bondage and freedom are in Buddhai, and that the Purua is merely a witness. Hariharananda adds that when Buddhai is impure due to the dust of Rajas and darkness of Tamas, it does not discriminate between seer and seen. He notes that Rajas can mean dust, and as such, it tarnishes the pure lucidity of Sattva. Tamas, in turn, means darkness, and this obscures Sattva even more densely than does Rajas. When purified and the natural illumination of Sattva is able to manifest, the knowledge of the distinction between these two entities becomes clear. This is what vidya, knowledge, is. However, ultimately, even this knowledge is taking place in Buddhai and, as will be discussed below, is transcended in the higher stages of samadhi. Buddhai has to deconstruct itself. Therefore the Skyakarika states, no one is actually bound, nor is anyone liberated from sasra. Only Prakti in its myriad forms transmigrates, is bound, and then freed. LXII. 2. 19 Vivya, Liga, Mpralinigwa, Parvivaya, particularized, Avya, unparticularized, Liga, distinctive, Matra, only, just, Alingani, indistinctive, Gwa, the modes, influences, Parvi, stages. The different stages of the Gwa qualities consist of the particularized, the unparticularized, the distinctive, and the indistinctive. This sutra follows on the previous one by outlining the basic categories of evolutes that emerge from the primordial interaction of the Gwas in Prakti. The first category noted by Patanjali, the particularized, Vaya, refers to all final evolutes of Prakti, that is, to end products that do not produce further products or evolutes out of themselves. The second category, the unparticularized, Avya, refers to the evolutes that do produce further products or evolutes out of themselves. Thus, if we glance at the Sakya chart in the introduction, the gross elements, ether, air, fire, water, earth, are the particularized aspects of the unparticularized subtle elements, sound, touch, sight, taste, smell. 39 Along similar lines, the powers behind the five organs of knowledge, ears, eyes, skin, tongue, and nose, as well as those behind the five organs of action, speech, hands, feet, anus, and genitals, along with the internal organ of mind, are the particularized aspects of the unparticularized ego, ahakara. 40. Since the mind works through these 10 organs, it also is considered an organ. 41. Thus, there are 16 particularized items including mind, none of which produces further evolutes, and 6 unparticularized ones including ego, which do produce evolutes. This schema is found in the Skyakarika 3. Beyond these there is Maha, which is another name for the cosmological Buddhai, referred to in the sutra as Liga by Patanjali and translated here rather loosely as distinctive. The commentators have different views on why Liga is used in this regard. Vijanabhiku, for example, states that Liga, literally mark, or sign, is so called because it marks all the other effects of the world, that is, everything. Everything emanates from Buddhai. 42. Ego, which is the immediate source from which all the particularized and unparticularized elements mentioned above have evolved, is itself a manifestation of Buddhai. Liga in Hindu logic is something that is the sign of something else. Smoke is the sign of fire. So whereas Prakti herself is unperceivable, Buddhai is perceivable. It has signs or characteristics that distinguish it. Buddhai is like the root of a tree, says Akara, it is the closest to the seed that produced it, and it is also the cause of the trunk, branches, leaves, etc., which stem from it. But Buddhai, too, is ultimately a transformation of the Gwas, specifically that of Sattva. It is pure beingness, says Vyasa, neither existence nor non-existence, neither real nor unreal. The world of manifest reality has yet to emerge from it. It is like the mind just awakened from sleep but prior to the activity that occurs in the ego stage, says Vijanabhiku. He quotes the Bhagavata Pura, then, impelled by the time factor, the entity Maha came into existence from the unmanifest. Its nature is knowledge, which dispels ignorance, and it manifests the universe which is situated within itself. 3. 5.27. Finally, the unmanifest mentioned in the sutra is a yet more subtle manifestation of these guas, the primordial matrix from which even Buddha itself, along with all its evolutes, originates. At this level, we have arrived at Prakti herself, and it is this that Patanjali refers to here as Alaga, that without signs, the undistinctive, see also I. 45. There are no signs by which one can discern Prakti prior to the movement of the guas, thus the Skya school holds that Prakti cannot be perceived, its existence can only be inferred in Umanita, and thus it is called the inferred 143. This stage is eternal, the other three stages Buddhi, Ahakra, and all subsequent evolutes are temporary manifestations, or permutations of Prakti. Therefore, says Vyasa, the world created by the guas may appear to have the nature of birth and death, but all that is really occurring is that the evolutes of the guas are manifesting and unmanifesting the various bodies and things of this world due to the constant flux of the guas themselves. If Devdutta's cows die, he analogizes, we may think Devdutta has become poor, but his poverty is due to the death of his cows, not his own death. Similarly, there is no birth and death of Purua, simply the constant mutation and transformation of the guas of Prakti within which Purua appears to be embedded, which temporarily produce bodies and forms in certain configurations, and then dissolve them back into their matrix. Vijanabhika quotes the Gita, all beings are unmanifest in their beginning, manifest in their interim stage, and unmanifest in their end. What is there to lament in this? 2. 28. The evolutes, such as bodies and states of mind, are temporary configurations, only the cause is eternal, Prakti herself. Vaikaspati Misra reiterates that everything one experiences in manifest reality, whether on the grossest level of sensual indulgence or the most subtle level of discrimination between Buddhi and Purua, is ultimately taking place in Buddhi or its evolutes. He notes that Liga and Alaga are called non-existent by Vyasa because the guas are quiescent in this stage, devoid of effects, the senses and sense objects of the world, and therefore cannot fulfill the objectives of Purua, which, we recall, is for the purpose of providing either experience or liberation to the Purua. At the same time, Vyasa also states that they are not totally non-existent, like the lotus in the sky, because they produce effects. In other words, they exist as cause. Quoting various passages from the Vedanta Sutras, Vijanabhika again takes this opportunity to distinguish the philosophy of the Yoga school from that of the Advaita, non-dualist Vedantic school founded by Akara. The Advaita school posits that Prakti, the guas, and the entirety of the manifest world are all ultimately not real but are mental constructions produced by ignorance, superimpositions on the only real existent, Brahman. Outlining the position of the Yoga school, Vijanabhika stresses that the world in its essence Prakti is real and eternal, and therefore the evolutes from this matrix, the world, are also in this sense real, albeit temporary, and constantly changing, mutating, and eventually dissolving back into their source. He quotes the well-known verse from the Chandogya Upanishad in reference to objects made out of clay, which we call pots or plates, etc. Out of convenience, but which remain, essentially, clay. By means of just one lump of clay, one can perceive everything made out of clay. The transformation is just a verbal handle, a name, while the reality is just this, it is clay. 6. 1.4. The manifestations of Brahman are not false, Vijanabhika argues, contra Akara, any more than the modifications of clay are false. But they are temporary. Vaikaspati Misra further states that manifest reality has to follow the sequence of evolution noted by Patanjali in the sutra. It is not that the seed of a Nyagrudha tree will spontaneously and immediately produce a fully grown, stocky tree with its leaves and branches, he says. The tree comes about gradually, the seed becoming a shoot and slowly evolving in contact with light and water. At the same time, says Vijanabhiku, seed, sprout, and tree are non-different from each other, and so, in the same way, are Buddhi and its effects non-different. Purua, on the other hand, is a totally different entity. When Purua and Prakti combine, living beings come into existence, just as when air and water combine, bubbles are formed. 2. 20 Dradai, Drasudo Pi Pratyanopaydra, the seer, Dai, the power of seeing, Dra, only, Ada, pure, API, although, Pratyaya, ideas or images of the mind, Anupaya, witnesses the seer is merely the power of seeing, however, although pure, he witnesses the images of the mind. The scene the guas of Prakti and their effects has been discussed in the above sutras, and now Patanjali turns his attention to the seer, Dra. The seer is the Purua, the soul, or innermost conscious self. He is the pure undiluted power of consciousness, pure because untouched by any attribute, qualification, object, or predicate. He is neither the same as, nor, at least when embodied, totally different from Buddhi, intelligence, insofar as his knowledge of Prakti arises from his awareness of Buddhi. He is not the same as Buddhi, because Buddhi has external things, cows, pots, etc., as its object of attention and is therefore always changing, while Purua is unchanging and has only Buddhi as the object of its attention. Moreover, Buddhi exists solely for the sake of Purua, while Purua exists for its own sake only. Finally, Buddhi is inert, unconscious, and composed of the three guas, whereas Purua is the active spectator, the source of consciousness, and beyond the three guas. On the other hand, Purua is not totally distinct from Buddhi in practice because, even though Purua is pure and self-contained in essence, by witnessing the transformations of Buddhi in the form of thoughts and cognitions, pratyayas, etc., it appears as if those thoughts pertain to Purua itself, that they are Purua rather than the flickerings of an external and inert but subtle substance. Purua sees its reflection in the mirror of Buddhi, say the commentators, and the mind mistakes this reflection in the mirror, which is distorted due to the transformations of the guas, to be the real self. Purua does not change or transform, Buddhi does. Therefore, it is said, says Vyasa, that although Purua is the experiencer and does not change or pursue the objects of the senses, it appears to do so by its identification with the transformations of Buddhi, which does change and does pursue the objects of the senses. Indeed, it is only when Buddhi takes the form of the objects of the senses, the pratyayas, noted here, ci. 10, that these objects become known to Purua via the medium of Buddhi. And it is only Purua who can inherently know, says Vijanabhiku, Buddhi does not know, that is to say, is not conscious of the objects of the senses that it is processing and that it exhibits to Purua. One might analogize that the software of a computer is not conscious of the material that it is processing and that it exhibits on its screen. As the computer needs a witness to know the data, so does Buddhi. Thus, as a result of being identified with Buddhi, Purua appears to assume the qualities of Buddhi. The consciousness of Purua